How a Ghost Ship Destroyed Hitler's Superdock. In March 1942, when the Second World War still had no obvious ending, the city of Saint-Nazaire stood on the Atlantic coast of occupied France. To an ordinary person, it was a port city. Docks, cranes, warehouses, wet air, salt water, fuel, iron, and machine oil. To the German command, it was a valuable naval base. But to the British, Saint-Nazaire was not merely another port. It was one of the most dangerous points on the map of Europe. Inside the port stood the enormous Normandie dry dock. It had originally been built for the great French ocean liner Normandie, one of the largest ships of its era. The dock was so large that it could receive the biggest vessels in the world. After the fall of France, this engineering giant passed into German hands. From that moment, British planners no longer saw it as a civilian dock. They saw it as a strategic doorway through which Germany's heavy fleet might one day threaten the Atlantic. The British fear had a name: Tirpitz. Tirpitz was a German battleship, the sister ship of the famous Bismarck. Bismarck had already taught Britain a brutal lesson. One large German warship used at the right moment could create a crisis at sea. Bismarck had sunk HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, and forced Britain to throw enormous naval and air resources into the pursuit that followed. Bismarck was eventually destroyed, but the warning remained. If Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic and began hunting Allied convoys, it could become more than a battleship. It could become a strategic nightmare. Britain was an island, and an island lives by the sea. Across the Atlantic came food, oil, weapons, aircraft, machinery, men, and the supplies that kept Britain alive in the war. A single battleship could not win the war by itself, but it could force convoys to scatter, compel escorts to be strengthened, draw away ships and aircraft, and threaten the fragile supply system that Britain depended on. Tirpitz did not even have to sink everything it met. Its mere presence could distort strategy. But every giant has a weakness. Tirpitz could not be repaired anywhere. If a ship of that size suffered serious damage, it needed a giant dry dock. On the Atlantic coast of France, Saint-Nazaire was the place that mattered. As long as the Normandy dock remained intact, a German battleship could theoretically operate more boldly, sail into the Atlantic, attack Allied shipping, take damage, and then retreat to a protected French port for repair. If the dock were destroyed, Tirpitz would lose its most important Atlantic repair option. The British conclusion was simple and ruthless. If they could not guarantee the destruction of Tirpitz itself, they would destroy its refuge. But Saint-Nazaire was not an easy target. The port did not sit openly on the coast. It lay inland along the Loire estuary. To reach it, ships had to navigate difficult waters and approach a fortified harbor under the guns of German defenses. From the air, the dock was also difficult to destroy with certainty. Bombers could damage a port, but the Normandy dock was huge, heavily built, and not the kind of structure that could be reliably disabled by uncertain hits from the sky. The British did not need a dramatic raid that merely damaged buildings. They needed the dock made useless. That meant explosives had to be delivered almost directly to the gates. From this requirement came a plan that sounded almost insane. Take an old destroyer, turn it into a floating bomb, drive it through German defenses at night, ram it into the gates of the dry dock, and detonate it on a delayed fuse. The plan was not simply to attack Saint-Nazaire. It was not merely to land commandos or sabotage machinery. It was to use an entire warship as a one-way weapon. The operation was given the code name Operation Chariot. The ship chosen for the ramming attack was HMS Campbeltown. It was not a new ship. It had originally been the American destroyer USS Buchanan, built during the First World War, and later transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. In a conventional naval battle, Campbeltown was already outdated. It was old, limited, and expendable. But for Operation Chariot, that made it perfect. It did not have to survive. It had only one job: reach the dock gates and die in exactly the right place. Before the raid, Campbeltown was heavily modified. Some of its equipment and armament were removed. The ship was lightened. Its silhouette was altered. Its funnels were cut down and reshaped so that, at a distance and in darkness, it might resemble a German vessel. This was not a disguise that would survive close inspection. It was camouflage meant to buy minutes, maybe only seconds. But in a night raid, seconds could decide everything. If German lookouts hesitated, if a searchlight did not immediately fix the target, if the order to fire came late, Campbeltown might get close enough. The most important part of the ship was hidden inside it. More than 4 tons of amytal explosive were packed into the forward section of the destroyer. The charges were concealed behind steel and concrete so that the Germans would not easily find or remove them. The explosion was not supposed to happen at the moment of impact. It was meant to come hours later. That delay was one of the most frightening and clever parts of the plan. The Germans were supposed to see the ship jammed into the dock gates. They were supposed to think the attack had already been defeated. They were supposed to believe that the British were dead, captured, or fleeing, and that the old destroyer had become nothing more than a strange trophy and a damaged object for inspection. Only then would Campbeltown perform its real task. But one ship could not do everything. Alongside Campbeltown came a flotilla of small craft, including motor launches and other light vessels. On board were British commandos. Their mission was to land in the port and destroy pumping stations, machinery, locks, electrical systems, and other parts of the dock infrastructure. A dry dock was not simply a hole in the ground where a ship could be placed. It was a complex system. Gates, pumps, machinery, and power had to work together. If the British only damaged the gates, the Germans might concentrate on repair. If the raiders also damaged the machinery and support systems, recovery would become much harder. Operation Chariot was therefore a combined naval and commando raid. The force was small compared with the scale of the target. Roughly 600 men, sailors and commandos, were to attack a fortified port defended by coastal guns, searchlights, anti-aircraft weapons, German troops, and the difficult geography of the Loire estuary. On a map, the plan looked complicated but possible. In reality, it depended on navigation, darkness, timing, tide, German reaction, discipline under fire, and whether an old destroyer could reach a precise target before being destroyed. The night of March 27th to 28th, 1942, was the night when the plan stopped being a drawing and became movement, noise, fear, and metal. The British force moved toward the French coast. The sea in darkness did not look like a heroic stage. It was cold, wet, dangerous, and indifferent. On the ships, men checked weapons, charges, equipment, and orders. Some thought about the mission. Some thought about home. Some said little, because before operations like this, extra words can feel useless. Many knew that returning was possible, but not likely, especially for those who would have to land inside the port itself. At first, the British tried to buy time through deception. They used signals to delay the German response. In the darkness and uncertainty, the altered silhouette of Campbeltown might briefly create confusion. But the closer the flotilla came to Saint-Nazaire, the less room there was for illusion. The Germans began to realize something was wrong. Searchlights cut into the night. Coastal batteries came alive. Then the harbor opened fire. The water around the British vessels flashed with shell bursts. Tracer fire crossed the darkness. The small craft, weakly protected and in many cases highly vulnerable, came under murderous fire. They were supposed to carry commandos to landing points, but many were hit, set ablaze, disabled, or thrown off course before they could do their work. Men aboard them knew that their vessels might become fireballs at any moment. Fire came from the shore, from port defenses, from positions that the Germans were now bringing fully into action. In such conditions, no plan remains clean. It breaks apart into separate decisions, commands, shouted warnings, efforts to hold course, and attempts to survive long enough to complete one more task. Campbeltown continued forward. Its task was simpler and more terrifying than the task of the smaller craft. It did not need to survive. It did not need to win a naval duel. It did not need to withdraw. It needed to hit the gates. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Halden Beatty had to bring the ship to the target under fire. In that moment, the entire operation narrowed into one line: an old destroyer, a German-held port, and the gates of the Normandie dock. If Campbeltown missed, if it grounded in the wrong place, if it was stopped too early, the operation would lose its purpose. Campbeltown struck. At high speed, the destroyer rammed into the southern gate of the dock. The impact drove the ship into the structure. The old destroyer became a steel wedge lodged in the target. From the outside, it looked like the climax of a desperate attack. The ship had broken through and died. But in reality, that was only the first act. Inside the hull, the hidden charges were still waiting. Almost immediately after the ramming, the commandos began landing. Their battle was a tragedy and an achievement of its own. Small groups had to move through a port that was awake, burning, firing, and filling with German troops. They had to find their objectives, place charges, destroy machinery, and disable systems. Some groups reached their targets and accomplished what they had come to do. Others were caught under fire. Communications failed. Routes became impossible. Boats intended for evacuation were destroyed or damaged. The raid became a maze of smoke, noise, broken plans, and individual courage. One of the most tragic aspects of the raid was the collapse of evacuation. Many of the small craft intended to take the commandos home were destroyed or rendered unusable. Men could do their assigned work and then discover that the way back no longer existed. The sea route was closed. The port was under German control. The city lay ahead. Ammunition was limited. The wounded were nearby. This is the point at which military history stops looking like a clean diagram and becomes a human disaster. On a map, an arrow of withdrawal looks simple. In reality, it may not exist. Some British troops tried to fight their way through the town and escape overland. This was almost impossible. To leave an occupied French port, evade German cordons, find help, and eventually reach neutral territory. A few men did succeed, but for most of the raiding force, the night ended in death or captivity. Many were surrounded. Some ran out of ammunition. Others were too wounded to continue. The Germans gradually restored control over Saint-Nazaire. By morning, it seemed that the British had paid an enormous price. The old ship was lodged in the dock. The port was damaged. Many attackers were dead or captured. To the Germans, it may have looked like the main danger had passed. This is where the most sinister part of the story begins. Campbeltown was still lodged in the dock gates. The Germans inspected it. To them, it was a trophy, a piece of evidence, a strange British ship that had managed to break into the port and ram the dock. German soldiers, officers, and specialists came near it. Some climbed aboard. They studied the damage. They tried to understand what had happened. Around them was the feeling that the main battle was finished. Prisoners had been gathered. Fires were being dealt with. The port was recovering from the chaos of the night. But Campbeltown was not a trophy. It was a trap. Later that morning, the delayed charges detonated. The explosion was enormous. The ship that the Germans had begun to treat as a captured object suddenly became a weapon again. Campbeltown was torn apart. The dock gate was destroyed. German soldiers and specialists who were nearby or on the ship were killed. The Normandie dock was disabled. This was the moment for which men had sailed through fire, for which the old destroyer had been turned into a ghost ship, for which commandos had landed in the hell of Saint-Nazaire. The principal objective had been achieved. A further episode the next day showed how deeply the raid had disturbed German confidence. Delayed action torpedoes fired by the British motor torpedo boat MTB-74 exploded near the old entrance to the basin. After further blasts, the Germans feared that British commandos might still be hidden in the town. Alarm, searches, confusion, and additional casualties followed. Operations like this do not end neatly with the last planned shot. They leave behind fear, suspicion, and disorder. The cost of Operation Chariot was severe. Of roughly 611 or 612 men who took part, only 228 returned to Britain. 169 were killed, and more than 200 were taken prisoner. German losses were also significant, especially among those caught by the delayed explosion of Campbeltown. But the strategic result was clear. The Saint-Nazaire dock could no longer perform its critical function. It remained out of action for the rest of the war. That meant Tirpitz had lost the most important repair option it might have used on the Atlantic coast of France. The raid was recognized with an extraordinary number of decorations. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest British award for gallantry in the face of the enemy. Among the recipients were Stephen Beatty, the commander of Campbeltown, Robert Ryder, the naval force commander, Augustus Charles Newman, the commando commander, and posthumously, Sergeant Thomas Durant and able seaman William Savage. Durant's story became especially famous. He continued firing while severely wounded, and his courage was recognized even by the enemy. Such details matter because behind the word operation are specific men, not abstract bravery. Operation Chariot is often called one of the most daring raids of the Second World War. That is not an exaggeration. It combined nearly everything that makes a military story unforgettable: a strategic threat, an almost impossible target, an old ship, deception, a night approach, a ramming attack, commandos, a delayed explosion, heavy losses, and a result that mattered far beyond the immediate battle. It was not a victory in the ordinary sense, where one army captures ground and raises a flag. The British did not hold Saint-Nazaire. They did not destroy the entire port. They lost ships and men. But they destroyed the thing they had come to destroy. That is the special logic of sabotage warfare. Sometimes the objective is not to occupy, but to deny. Not to defeat a whole garrison, but to break a mechanism. Not to hold a harbor, but to make it useless for the enemy's central purpose. Saint-Nazaire was exactly that kind of target. The Normandie dock was not simply a concrete structure. It was part of Germany's naval strategy. By destroying it, the British changed the risk calculation for German heavy warships. There was also a psychological effect. To the Germans, Saint-Nazaire was a fortified port deep inside occupied territory. It was supposed to be protected. But the British came by night, broke through the defenses, rammed a ship into the dock gates, and detonated it after many had assumed the danger had passed. Such a blow does not only damage infrastructure, it attacks confidence. It proves that even a protected place can be reached if the enemy is willing to pay the price and invent a method bold enough to reach it. For Britain, the raid became a symbol of a period when the war was still extremely hard. In 1942, victory did not feel close. The Eastern Front was vast and bloody. North Africa remained contested. The Atlantic was still deadly. German U-boats were hunting convoys. In such a situation, every successful daring operation mattered not only as a military blow, but as proof of spirit. It showed that the enemy could be hit, even in a fortified port, even at night, even with an old ship. But the story should not be romanticized too easily. Behind the striking image of the ghost ship were men who did not return, sailors on burning launches, commandos who completed their tasks but found no way back, prisoners who later learned that the operation had succeeded, families who never saw their sons, husbands, brothers, or fathers again. Military history becomes powerful not when it turns death into spectacle, but when it shows the price of the result. And still, HMS Campbeltown became a legend, not because it was the strongest ship, not because it won a naval duel, not because it returned home to cheers. It became a legend because it had been selected for death, reached its target, and after its own death delivered the main blow. Its image is almost mythic. An old ship disguised to confuse the enemy, entering a fortified harbor at night, ramming the gate, appearing defeated and then exploding to destroy the thing it was sent to destroy. If this story were a film, the strongest image might not be the ramming and not even the explosion. The strongest image would be the morning between them. Campbeltown is already stuck in the gate. The night battle is over. Germans are walking around it. Prisoners stand under guard. Smoke rises from the port. Someone thinks it is finished. And the viewer knows what the people inside the scene do not know. Inside the dead ship, the delayed blow is still alive. That waiting is the true power of Operation Chariot. The Saint-Nazaire Raid shows that war is not only a collision of armies. It is also a contest of engineering, intelligence, imagination, and resolve. The British found the weakness not in the armor of Tirpitz, but in its logistics. They attacked not the battleship itself, but the condition that would have made it more dangerous. They understood that a giant ship depends on a giant dock, and that a giant dock can be destroyed by an old destroyer if that destroyer can be brought to the gate and turned into a bomb. That is why the story of Saint-Nazaire works so powerfully. It has clear stakes, the safety of the Atlantic supply lines. It has a frightening threat, Germany's heavy surface fleet. It has a specific target, the Normandie dock. It has a wild plan, a ship bomb. It has a central object, HMS Campbeltown. It has a human cost, the dead, the captured, the wounded. It has a delayed ending, the explosion that comes after the enemy has relaxed. And it has a result. The dock remained unusable for the rest of the war. When people call it one of the greatest raids, they do not mean it was the largest in numbers or the widest in geography. Its greatness lies elsewhere. A small force struck a large strategic system. An old ship changed the calculation of the German fleet. An operation that could have ended as a disaster achieved its purpose because its true blow was hidden in the silence after the battle. HMS Campbeltown did not return home. It was never meant to. Its mission was different. It came out of the darkness, took the fire, rammed the gate, and became part of the dock it had been sent to destroy. The Germans saw a trophy, but they were looking at a weapon that had not yet fired. When the explosion finally came, it was not merely the destruction of metal and concrete. It was the answer to the question of why an old destroyer had sailed into an impossible port at night. That is how a ghost ship destroyed Hitler's Superdock. Not by the strength of a fleet, not by victory in open battle, not by numerical superiority, but by identifying the enemy's vulnerable point with precision. War often remembers huge armies and great battles, but sometimes its course is shaped by one night, one harbor, one dock, and one old ship that was doomed from the beginning, and for that very reason was able to complete its mission to the end.